let me hand over the mic to our chair this morning, Dr. Robert Danon, and look forward to your initial context setting to make this panel discussion even more lively and interesting.
The text of the treaty is the authentic and objective expression of the intention of the two contracting states. We will be speaking, of course, of the new BEPS preamble that was included in the OECD Model Convention. The preamble is context from the perspective of treaty interpretation, but it is only context. It is not something that you can use to override the clear. We will also speak about the principal purpose test, and there, perhaps to contextualize the principal purpose test, although this might seem obvious, I think it's important to distinguish three facts, three steps when you look at the problem of improper use of tax treaties. The first step is the establishment of the facts. And there you may detect a sham arrangement, for example, or a simulated operation. As you look, for example, under civil law, you have the concept of simulated operation. This has nothing to do with the improper use of tax treaties. This is just setting the facts correctly. Then you move to the second level, which is the interpretation of treaty law along the lines of the Vienna Convention. And only as a last resort, you look, if treaty benefits are to be granted after the second step, only as a last resort, you look at the principal purpose test. I think it's important to remind that this is the order so that the principal purpose test is properly contextualized.
When we talk of the object and purpose of the relevant provisions of the convention, which is the second condition of the PPT, which was referred to as the objective condition, I've always wondered, especially given the Indian context of Circular 789, the way it was, the entire Azadi Bachao arguments were taking place, and the fact that the Union of India itself was defending its Circular 789 and so on, and the Mauritius Treaty. Wasn't the object and purpose so evident to invite foreign investments? And how that interplays with the latest protocol that has been released and the 2016 protocol which grandfathered all investments up to 1st April 2017. So that would be an interesting aspect which I'm sure we'll go through as we go along.
It's worth reminding ourselves that the history here has shown a gradual development towards more and more focus on treaty abuse and less on the issue of avoiding double taxation. Historically, if you look at the early discussions at the OECD, there was relatively little concern about the abuse of tax treaties. There was much more focus on making certain that the treaty operated as it is supposed to avoid double taxation. It's really only in the 1960s, so 50 years or more after treaties began to start being used as the principal instrument, that the beneficial ownership limitation began to appear in tax treaties because of concern that one might register shares in the name of a nominee or agent to get treaty access. And then gradually over the years, greater concern has been shown about avoidance, with focus on conduit companies in the 1980s, then the relationship between treaties and domestic anti-avoidance rules, whether they are targeted rules or GARs in the 1990s. That led in the very early 2000s to the OECD, who have been subject very much to this growing focus on improper use of tax treaties rather than proper use. The commentary in Article 1 had this new section on improper use of conventions. The BEPS project, which has already been mentioned, had as one of its action points preventing treaty abuse, and that led on to the adoption of either an approach based upon a limitation on benefit provision or the principal purpose test that we'll come on to discuss in a moment, and that's reflected in Article 7 of the BEPS MLI, and now appears in the OECD model itself in Article 29. One might even say that this continuing focus on improper use continues to the present day with the introduction of an almost incomprehensible subject to tax rule by the OECD this year. So we have a historical movement there to add more and more anti-abuse provisions to tax treaties, and there's a great danger that one loses the original purpose of tax treaties, which was to avoid double taxation.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I don't think we disagree on treaty residence. I think my observation was more to say that it is a weak treaty residence test, but I didn't say that it should be changed. I think it is a fact that it is weak, it is mechanical, and ensures legal certainty. I guess my point was just to say that if we have treaty residence as it is today, we should not be shocked that you may get access to treaty benefits in the context of incorporating an entity which becomes liable to tax. And I would further add, as the energy case has shown, that you cannot read more into Article 4, even through the lens of the GAR, because the text of Article 4 is so clear. So it is a weak residence test, but I fully agree with the fact that it ensures legal certainty. My point in the weak residence test, it's just a fact.
Thank you so much.
I think we do disagree, because I think it should be a weak residence test, that it should not be difficult to access a treaty. Whether you then deny treaty benefits under a principal purpose test is a second level. But the first question is, these treaties are there in order to make certain that double taxation is avoided, and we're losing that focus on avoidance of double taxation by spending too much time focusing on the improper use of treaties. So I think we are disagreeing on our approach there, but I'll leave it to you in the panel to carry on this discussion.
I will conclude to say that we don't disagree, because I'm not saying that the treaty residence test should be different than it is. What I'm just saying is that it cannot simply be overridden with a GAR, as the Alta Energy case has said, but I am not again questioning the treaty residence test.
The LOB provision was to not shop the US-Dutch treaty, but you could shop another treaty. That was fine. So if you had a mixer in the Netherlands, that served to make sure that the source of income into the UK was all Dutch source, and you had all your other investments going to the Netherlands, and that's why you were using a Dutch company, then under the LOB provisions, the US competent authorities said, oh, that's fine. If you're shopping the UK treaty, I don't care. That's their problem, not my problem. So that was...
And Burlington raises a very interesting question, which is that the purpose test is part of a larger abuse of tax treaty test, right? So only if they can find that there's an abuse of tax treaty, either because of some artificial arrangement or some other reason, will they talk about the purpose of the taxpayer being a dominant tax avoidance purpose. And that's very interesting, because in applying the purpose test, Burlington has applied an abuse of tax treaty test, which is, I think, which I really found.
We just quickly look at, what could be substance versus what could be purpose in this slide before you. So substance, the way I see, is a manifestation, an actual manifestation of the operations on ground. So you have an office, you will have employees, you will have reality, day-to-day functions actually taking place. But substance by itself doesn't clearly answer the motive or the why. Principal purpose test seeks to answer the why, as in why you are undertaking an arrangement or an operation through a particular jurisdiction. There are tax reasons, there's a favorable treaty network, but in addition to that, are there also non-tax reasons? Are there also some commercial reasons? And these commercial reasons could be many, like a favorable IP regime, or business expansion, lower production costs, skilled labor force, and there are several such examples. So from a planning perspective, it's very important that in the new era where PPT is now a part of most of the tax treaties, we are very well aware of the why requirement as to why we are setting up shop in a particular jurisdiction. We may be opting for it because of a favorable treaty network, but we should also have some non-tax reasons which would safeguard us from a potential challenge from the tax authorities?
I think the question more is, how do you look at access to MAP in anti-abuse cases? The main point that comes across there is, when you look at MAP in itself, when does MAP apply? It's when a taxpayer considers that the action of one or both of the states results or will result in taxation not in accordance with the treaty, they can go to MAP, right? Now, when you think about in the BEPS Section 14 context, we have agreed that states would give access to MAP in cases where they are entitled under the treaty. But there were some specific issues in there where you actually see that access to MAP was denied in the past, and anti-abuse is actually one of the areas where access to MAP was denied in the past. So I start with element 1.2 of the Action 14 minimum standard, where it was agreed that countries should provide MAP access in cases where there is a disagreement between the taxpayer and the tax authorities making the adjustment in two situations. First, if the disagreement is as to whether the conditions to apply a treaty anti-abuse provision have been met, so the conditions of a PPT or LOB, for example, or as to whether the application of a domestic law anti-abuse provision is in conflict with the provisions of a treaty.
If one were to apply what I would submit is a balanced interpretation, then under no circumstances do you come to an outcome that would in any manner dislodge the judicial reasoning in Tiger Global, for instance. So the question then that arises, and the question that Pranav put to me, was how do you reconcile retroactive, retrospective, prospective with regard to matters PPT? And I would effectively conclude to say that when you usher in PPT in its full form, I believe that there is an extreme need for ensuring that you permit for those structures and or obviously transactions which are done, you can't revisit those, but transactions of the type that were in the past that would be eligible for grandfathering, which would effectively perhaps be under scrutiny on account of a series of transactions that followed, obviously must necessarily be given, as has been the grandfathering experience in the 2016 protocol, Mauritius. Similarly, you should, as a tax administration, tax administrations worldwide, should certainly ensure that there is scope for taxpayers who have structured their matters, particularly legacy structures, to restructure within a reasonable time frame, in a rational manner, such that would, for all intents and purposes, permit for them to ultimately ensure that their treaty entitlements are not compromised.